Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class, where today I keep talking about starting this whole story of Joseph. And today we really are, I promise you. Well, we sort of got into it last week as we found out his relationship with his brothers, his family situation. He was the favored son. His other brothers basically hated him. And as a result, they sold him into slavery. So this is kind of where we left him. And we're going to see now what happens next in his life. And I think if there's maybe any kind of theme in this part of the story, it's that in life, you go through ups and downs. And we're going to find, like, his life, in part we're going to be looking at today, is kind of like a roller coaster. And so we've left him, as you'll remember. His brothers were thinking of killing him. They decided not to. At least the older brother kind of convinced them not to. But once they threw him in the cistern, they knew they had to do something, because they couldn't explain that to, they know he would have gone back and told his father, and they would have been in big trouble. So they definitely had to get rid of him. And as it happened, well, this is part of God's sovereign plan, we're going to find out. Some Ishmaelites were coming along. They happened to be slave traders, and they gave his brothers gave them a good bargain on this kid that they wanted to get rid of. And I think probably that was a better plan than killing him, because they would have probably felt guilty the rest of their lives. This way, they knew he was still alive, but he was as good as dead, and so they haul him off down to Egypt. And we're going to find out that actually things don't go so bad for him down there. If we think of slaves as, well, people that just go out and work hard, slave all day, digging holes and things like that. But in that culture and in that time, you could be a doctor and be a slave. I mean, it was a little bit different. It was more like a contractual thing, but if you bought somebody as a slave, you definitely owned them, and they lost all of their freedom and all their right to any kind of life of freedom. So this is the situation that Joseph finds himself in, and we talked about that, where Jacob is pouring his heart out because he lost his son. He thinks he lost his son. The brothers are kind of like sheepishly looking around because they know they did something bad. And Joseph just had the rug pulled out from underneath him, because he's this rich kid and he's daddy's favorite boy. And now he's going to a strange land he knows nothing about. Actually, there's a parallel here between what he's experiencing now and later on what a young man named Daniel experiences. Well, we're a long way from getting to the story of Daniel, but we're going to see that there are some similarities between those two stories. Anyway, he ends up, and he finds himself being maybe resold to a man named Potiphar. And Potiphar was, I'm not sure if he was a politician or if he was a wealthy man in Egypt. And actually, Joseph does pretty well. As his servant, or slave of Potiphar. And we read about that. We'll start looking at some of the verses here in verse 5. It says that the blessing of the Lord was on everything that Potiphar had, and that was because of Joseph's presence, both in the house and the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. I mean, that's kind of cool? You're a rich guy, and usually rich people have to spend all their time worrying about their money. But he finds this young man who is really smart. He's going to find out later he's really good looking, and everybody liked him. He was very gifted, very talented, and we know he was blessed by God because he inherited that same blessing that his father Jacob had. And God has some real important plans for Joseph, we're going to see in the future. But he finds himself in Potiphar's household, and he's basically in charge of everything. I don't know how long this takes, but he's, from the time he gets there to the time that he meets his new master, and they discover all his talents and whatnot. I'm sure it took a year or so for him to come to the place where now he's in charge of everything in Potiphar's household. Okay, that's up. Now I would say that's up. You know, that's a much better situation than he was in when they hauled him off as a slave. What happens next? By the way, we're in chapter 39. I should have mentioned that in verse 6. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. And he goes on to explain how, you know, he would feel terrible to take advantage of this lady, you know, given everything that his master had given him. And then in verse 10, and though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. I guess you can kind of picture what Potiphar's wife, again, they don't give her a name, but they just call her Potiphar's wife. And she's the queen. Well, she's not a queen, I guess, but she's just a rich lady, probably spoiled. You know, I think in every culture and every time period, there's always somebody like that. And she's bored, you know, and she wants a little excitement in her life. And she sees this handsome young man, and who knows what's going on between her and Potiphar. You know, she maybe needs a little excitement in her life, but she's very attracted to this young man, Joseph. And you know, also given the fact that maybe she feels she has a right to command him because, after all, she owns him. He's her slave. And, you know, this was, you know, another pressure that she might have added to try to convince him to sleep with her. But he refuses. And again, there's a parallel here between him and Daniel. Daniel, you're going to have to read that story. It's in the book of Daniel, by the way. He refuses to eat the rich, expensive food that the king gives him. He refuses that, and he just sticks with the simple vegetarian diet. So again, there's some parallels between Daniel and Joseph. Joseph refused what, you know, if you weren't an upright person, you might have thought, oh, this is a great deal. I get to sleep with his wife and I get all this money. You know, some people might have thought that was a good thing. But Joseph has this connection with the living God, the God of his grandfather and his father and, you know, his great-grandfather. And so he knows it's the wrong thing to do. And he puts his foot down and he draws the line here, right here. And that did not go over so well with Potiphar's wife. She accuses him of molesting her. She lies about it. Since she can't get her way, she's going to put him in his place, and she tells her master that he tried to abuse her. And we pick this up, and now his reaction in verse 19. When his master, Potiphar, heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. So Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. You can understand if Potiphar really believes his wife, that, you know, Joseph, I'm sure he would have been very disappointed having put all this trust in Joseph. But he puts him in prison, which, well, you know, you could understand that. So what happens now? I guess you could say this is kind of a downturn in Joseph's life. So now he's in prison, and we're looking at verse 20 now. Well, while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. I don't know if you could say things are looking up, but I guess that's better than just being a run-of-the-mill prisoner. If you're going to be in prison, you might as well be a successful prisoner. So he kind of turns this into a bit of an upswing in his life. And it gives him something to do, preoccupies his time. I think there were a number of years that he was actually in this prison. And, you know, in these difficult times, God can use something like that to prepare you for what he has planned for you in the future. And I was thinking that this time in prison, Joseph was kind of an outsider to this whole culture. And he probably learned some really good lessons about life in Egypt. And maybe these were some lessons that he could have used later on when he, well, I can't tell you what happens next because that's going to be a surprise. But anyway, he finds himself in a prison, and there's a couple of other people in there that also were on, well, in this case, they were, one of them was the chief cupbearer to the king, and the other was the chief baker. And so the king, you don't want to mess with the king in those days because they have absolute authority. And so both the cupbearer, now the cupbearer would simply be the one that would bring, obviously, anything the king wanted to drink. But the other interesting thing about a cupbearer is he had to take a little sip of whatever it was that he was going to bring the king in case somebody was trying to poison the king. So I don't know what the life expectancy of a cupbearer was back then. I suppose it depended on how popular the king was. But anyway, we don't know what he did wrong, and we don't know what the chief baker did wrong, but the king was mad at them. I don't know, maybe the cupbearer spilled some coffee on the king one morning, and maybe the baker burnt the king's croissants. I don't know. We don't know what they did. But for whatever reason, the king threw them both in prison. So now Joseph is there in prison, and he gets to meet these two guys. And it gets, this is where things get a little more interesting, because each of these two prisoners, the cupbearer and the chief baker, end up having some dreams. And this is where Joseph, maybe, remember he had those dreams already. Maybe at this time in his life he sort of came to understand that this was kind of a gift maybe that he had, because he had these very vivid dreams. Remember that we talked about last time where he saw these sheaves and they were all bowing down to his sheaf, which was big. And then he had this other dream about the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowing down to him. Of course, that didn't make him very popular with his family, but I think maybe he came to realize that there's something special going on here with God in this ability to understand dreams. Well, anyway, these two guys have dreams. The first one was the cupbearer, and we read that in verse 9. In my dream, he explains, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. All right. I don't know how I would interpret that. I guess that sounds pretty positive, doesn't it? He gets this, he sees this vine, and he squeezes grape, and he brings it back to the king. Well, what does what does Joseph say about this? In verse 12, this is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to when you were cupbearer. Well, that must have been really good news for the chief cupbearer, and we find out that that is exactly what happened. But Joseph makes this request, and he says, when you come before the king, I guess he must have had faith that this was going to come true. He says, when you do come before the king, please remember me. Mention my situation here. Maybe he figured, well, I was able to interpret this dream, and maybe someday the king will just remember that, and that there's something, that I could do for him as well. Well, unfortunately, some time goes by, and the cupbearer kind of forgets all about Joseph. But there was this second dream, and the dream of the baker. And, that's kind of interesting too. And we read about that in verse 16. And the baker says that on my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. Okay, that's his dream. Now, I'm not so sure that one doesn't sound quite so positive as the dream of the cupbearer. Well, let's see what Joseph says about that in verse 18. This is what it means, Joseph said. These 3 baskets are 3 days, and within 3 days Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh. Oh man, I guess that didn't bring a lot of joy to this poor baker who had probably, I don't know if at this point he had already seen, the fulfillment of the cupbearer's dream and knew that happened, then knowing now that he himself was going to face certain death when he goes back to the king. Well, the whole point is that this is Joseph, and he proves his ability to interpret these dreams. But it's still kind of a situation where he doesn't see any results of this. And this is where this part of the story, this is how far we're going to go today. But the thing that I think really impressed me about this part of the story, of course I know where it's going, and probably some of you do as well, is that you have these ups and downs in life. And sometimes the things that you think are bad, well, they really are bad, but they can bear some fruit in your life. They can serve to prepare you for something that is going to happen in the future. And we're going to see that's exactly what happened. But just think about Joseph's life in general. He starts out, and he is the favorite son. He's a rich kid. He is the favorite son of his father. He has this cool coat, which makes him stand out amongst his brothers. And he also, I think he's getting a sense through those dreams that God had something special he wanted to do with him. He not only had a blessing from his father, but that he also had this blessing from God in a purpose. That's what these dreams, I think, were telling him, that God was going to do something special with him, even though his family didn't want to hear anything about that. So he's off to a good start. But, all this contention between him and his brothers lead to his being sold as a slave. So that's not a good thing. So now things are going downhill. But then once he finds himself in Egypt and gets acclimated a little bit, and he finds himself in Potiphar's household, things are looking up again. And he also has the opportunity to make a very, definite stand in terms of what he believes is right and wrong. So he really didn't do anything wrong. He had nothing to feel guilty about, but he ends up in prison again. So now, the arrow's kind of pointing down. But he gets to prison, and he finds a little bit of success while he's in jail. Like we said, if you're going to be in prison, be a good prisoner, and do the best you can as a prisoner. And that's exactly what he did. So things, maybe looking up a little bit, but then he has this hope that this message that he sends to the king by way of the cupbearer goes unspoken. And now he is, I'm not real sure at the time. I think there was something I remembered about 13 years. I'm not sure how long he was in prison, but you can just imagine what that must have been like, thinking, I wonder if the cupbearer said anything to the king. I wonder if any day now I'm going to be hearing, you've been pardoned because the king heard about your, ability to interpret dreams. And then eventually, we're jumping ahead a little bit, he's discouraged in prison. We're going to find out that the next thing that will happen is that indeed he will be discovered by the king, but not in an easy way. So what do we learn from all of this? Well, first of all, God has decided he's going to do something special in the life of Joseph. And when that happens, it doesn't, and you can look at anybody that God points his finger to and says, I'm going to use you. It doesn't always result in a life of ease. Let's put it that way. We can think about Noah. You know, he had to spend 100 years rolling up his sleeve. This 600-year-old guy, or well, he was 500 when he started building the ark. And maybe that's not what he had planned for his retirement days, but he had this huge challenge before him. So it wasn't easy for him. And we're seeing that God is calling Joseph to a purpose that we're going to find out exactly what that was. But in the process, it wasn't just going from point A to point B with a straight line and no, problems in between. That God is bringing him through all of these different experiences, the ups and the downs. And this is, I guess, a good example of very often how God uses us. If he calls us to accomplish something for his kingdom, we can't always, I think some people, I'm going to be a Christian and then nothing bad's ever going to happen to me the rest of my life because God's going to protect me. Well, that's not exactly what Jesus said. Jesus said, blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you for my name's sake. But he says, rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. And I think we're seeing that, and we're going to see that, how that works out for Joseph, so that it becomes a blessing to him, but not just to him, eventually to his whole family. So, if you want to find out how this all works out, you'll have to join us again next time on Gen Z Bible Class.